Welcome once again to another TMG interview. I'm Paul Preston, joined here by fellow movie guy and frequent contributor to the movieguys.net, Ray Scalacci. And we're happy to be talking to an author and a Hollywood do-it-all guy, really. Here are some examples. He was a story analyst at Universal and Fox, as well as an executive story editor at Paramount Pictures, where he did jobs like giving story notes for Top Gun and supervising the early development of The Godfather Part 3. No small job and no small movies. He eventually worked all over Hollywood, Disney, TriStar, Orion, HBO, and more, producing and writing films such as the Ed Harris thriller The Last Innocent Man. And did I say author? Yes. Now his mystery book, Someone to Watch Over Me, is available at all the usual suspect places to go for a book, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and more. Please welcome Dan Bronson, everybody. Well, there is much to discuss, especially when you've worked all over Hollywood and with the people you've worked with. But let's begin with that book. Our own Ray Scalacci here has described it in a review you can now read at themovieguys.net as the main character being a babysitter to the spoiled children of the silver screen, trying to keep them from destroying themselves in the late 40s. So there's mystery, there's classic Hollywood. How do you describe the book to a potential reader? For example, everyone listening now.
Well, it's something that I've been thinking about for, 10, 15 years. I wanted to do, I find the post-war period, it takes place in Hollywood in 1947. And I find that period of post-war Hollywood fascinating because it begins with the studio system still intact and very, very powerful. But the fissures in its foundation are already beginning to appear. Paramount consent decrees, the stars going out as independent contractors. It'll be Jimmy Stewart in a few years, making huge piles of money. Exactly the kind of thing that the studio heads tried to prevent right back at the beginning when they founded the studios. So it's a period of transition, and there's an awful lot going on. At any rate, I wanted my protagonist, my narrator, to be someone who'd been an actor, who'd been on the verge of stardom. World War II broke out. He volunteered, and he survived D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and the freeing of the death camps. And he comes back physically and emotionally scarred. He's got a big scar that runs right across his right cheek, and it's the kind of emblem of the scars that he has inside. He comes back numb, morally numb from what he's seen, and the studio takes pity upon him, gives him a job as a publicist. They didn't call them fixers in those days, but that's exactly what they were. Their job was to suppress publicity, and he's very, very good at it. And then he gets his most difficult assignment. He is made the nursemaid of the studio's sexpot star, their biggest star, the star of the picture in which the head of the studio has risked everything. And she's a mess. She requires 20, 30 takes on every shot. She's late to the set repeatedly. She disappears for periods of time. And that's exactly what happens. She disappears, and he has to find her without the help of anyone, including the police, because no one must know she's gone. So that's the setup, and I kind of have a lot of fun with it after that. The voice actor who has just completed the audiobook, I don't think it's up yet. He said that in the course of recording the book, he fell in love with Savannah, but he wants to marry Evil Wilde, the screenwriter character in the thing. So what I think he was saying is that the characters were as real for him as they are for me. I mean, these in my screenplays and in this book, the characters are always as real to me as you or anyone in my life. And one of the hard things is finishing a book or finishing a screenplay, because you're saying goodbye to people that you'll never know again as intimately as well as you have while you're writing them. At any rate, that's the long-winded version of the book.
It's so true about what you said about closing the last chapter of the book or the last page of a screenplay. It's sad and it can be depressive too. I need to ask, in regards to Someone to Watch Over Me, it starts off like a fun gossip tour of Hollywood in the 40s. And then suddenly you switch gears to this hard-boiled detective yarn. I understand you writing in your first book, your memoirs, but for your second book, what made you choose this genre, or did it choose you?
Oh, it chose me. I love the genre. I always have. It was actually a friend from Scotland who got me reading Raymond Chandler.
Ah.
She said, "You've got to read this guy. He's a wonderful writer." She mentioned this one line. She was a blonde to make a priest put his foot through a stained glass window. That's pretty damn good. A blonde to make a priest put his foot through a stained glass window. Anyhow, that sold me. So while I was over I spent a summer in England and Scotland studying Shakespearean production. I was back in my old academic days, and that was one of the great things about being an academic. You could get grants like that. And I spent whatever spare time I had reading the works of Raymond Chandler, and that did it. I fell in love. I'm still in love. I've read him. I've read Ross MacDonald. Well, all the greats over and over and over. It's a wonderful genre, and it's one that so often, in the hands of the best practitioners, rises above the level of the genre it's in, rises above the level of mere entertainment to art. You see that again and again and again. And I know the complaint of people like Ross MacDonald and Raymond Chandler was they don't take us seriously. We're just mystery writers. Well, there are a lot of mystery writers who are also very serious writers, and I like to think of myself as among them. The book means a great deal to me.
Dan, I'm wondering, you started off as a former English and American literature professor and suddenly gave up that career for the unstableness of Hollywood. Now, first I got to ask, were you married at the time?
Yes.
Okay. How did your wife feel about that? And why did you suddenly decide to do that?
Honey, we're going to be financially unstable. Is that cool? Thanks. Great. Pack the car.
Well, I was hired as the Shakespeare professor and the American literature professor. And we had this thing called winter term. We were on a 2-semester system. And in the month between the fall semester and the spring semester, each faculty member was allowed to teach anything that they wanted, whether they were qualified or not. Well, I chose film. And usually in a winter term course, a faculty member would get 5, 6 students. I got over 100. And I had a wonderful, wonderful time teaching this course. And I used the success of it as an argument for making it part of the regular curriculum. So I got the Intro to Film course established, and then I got a film seminar course established. My favorite was one in Hitchcock and Wells. And then I got a contact. I made a contact at the Directors Guild, and I got internships for my students for the best of my students at the Directors Guild. And then I got a grant from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences to bring a director to campus. And I got Lamont Johnson, who was a wonderful friend and mentor in the years to come. He was an actor turned director. Probably his best known television film was The Execution of Private Slovik, but he did many of the greats, like That Certain Summer, My Sweet Charlie, on and on. Fear on Trial. I was just great, great movies. And he made a number of wonderful features as well, like The Last American Hero and The Mackenzie Break. Anyhow, he came to campus. We'd never met each other. I picked him up at I was teaching at DePauw University in Indiana at the time. And I went over to the airport. There were 300 people on that plane. We had never seen each other before. And we walked right to each other. And he had this big, booming voice. Matter of fact, he'd been the top radio actor in New York in the early days. He'd grown up with tuberculosis of the bones and was in bed, I think, until the age of 11. He grew up with adults. And at any rate, he was 4F during the war. And he had this Orson Welles voice, and he became a very, very successful radio actor. At any rate, we really hit it off. And I kept him running. We had this thing called the Lamont Johnson Film Festival. It ran for 3 days, and I kept the poor son of a gun running from 8 in the morning till about 2 in the next morning. And the climax of the whole thing was a screening of his wonderful basketball film, One on One. It had come out as a big hit. And I had arranged with Warner Brothers to screen it as the climactic event of the Lamont Johnson Film Festival. And it was to open our new Performing Arts Center. It's going to be the first thing. We had 1,000 people coming. The day before, I get a call from Warner Brothers saying, "Sorry, Dan, we couldn't get the clearances from the union. We're not going to be able to send you one-on-one." This is not good. So I called my friend at the Directors Guild and asked him if there was anything he could do. And the next day, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, these big heavy cans of film showed up at the Indianapolis airport, and we went ahead and showed it. During this, I introduced him and the film, and he was standing next to my wife. And I went on, as I tend to do at the introduction, and he said, he turns to my wife and says, "He really loves it, doesn't he?" And, yeah. Oh, and then afterwards he said, "Dan, come to Hollywood. I see you as a successful producer within 5 years." So with that encouragement, and it didn't take much encouragement, believe me, with that encouragement, I got a grant from the Lilly Endowment to support me in an internship at Universal. And through a contact, Will Hayes Jr., son of the morality of czar of Hollywood, who happened to be the mayor of Crawfordsville, Indiana, and who was among my friends there. I got the writer-director of Miracle on 34th Street and Airport, George Seaton, to sponsor me. I was going to be his apprentice. So off I went, and George was dying when I got to Hollywood. I actually we'd exchanged letters, but I only got to meet him once on his deathbed. He's barely able to talk in this darkened room. Made a joke at the beginning. Well, what happened is, he made Natalie Wood a star in Miracle on 34th Street. And at that point in time, I was apprenticed to Gil Cates, making what was not a very good movie, The Last Married Couple in America, starring Natalie Wood. So the night before I was to go meet George, I went to her and explained that he was dying and asked if she wanted to send him a note or something. She gave me a letter. Actually, she was like most stars, very standoffish, except those that she was very familiar with. She was a different person when RJ, her husband, showed up on the set. But she actually teared up. I couldn't believe it because she was pretty chilly to me and to almost everyone else on the set. And she gave me this letter that I carried to him. At any rate, he, bless him, he was Kris Kringle. He was that character that Edmund Gwenn played. I'm getting off on a tangent, but just about 2 weeks before he actually died, I got a phone call from him, and from him and his wife, and Phyllis. And they said, we're sorry we haven't kept in closer touch. But our son just died. And I thought, my God, they're calling me to see how I'm doing when they just lost their son. Anyhow, he was Kris Kringle. He put me in touch with the head of the physical plant at Universal, this guy named Al Dorskin, bald, dead rattlesnake eye, dead shark eyes. I'm convinced they modeled a shark after him in Jaws. And Al basically said, you got to pass to the studio. You're on your own, kid. So I went over and introduced myself to Verna Fields, the editor of Jaws, the mentor of Spielberg, mother cutter. And she took me under her wing and got me assigned to the Gil Cates movie. And eventually I made contact over with the new head of the story department. He offered me a job. I resigned my tenured professorship, the most secure job in America, and only to find that there was something called the Story Analyst Guild that wouldn't let me accept the job that I'd been offered. So I went for 4 or 5 months house sitting, homeless, house sitting, living on peanut butter and bananas, and $10 a week that I'd earned from writing a story for Current Biography about Marty Ritt. So that's again another long-winded story.
But you still demanded everybody call you professor, right? When you're that's what I would have done.
I didn't even let my students call me doctor. I just wasn't. Doctor was Dr. Basham, who brought me into the world. I was never comfortable with that. The only time I've ever used it is to get a good hotel room at places like the Ahwahnee in Yosemite.
That's the place.
Love the Ahwahnee.
I thought the most emotional part of that story was going to be that you were a courier for a letter from Natalie Wood to the man who started her career, and he was on his deathbed, and it turns out to be his actual death was even more. That story alone was up and down and all over the place. This is great. The Hollywood stories are never ending already. I can tell with you, which is great. But let's tie it back into the book, because now you've seen a bunch of students. You've told a brief history of your journey through Hollywood, and you choose to tell the story about out of control actors in the 40s. I think there are plenty of out of control actors today. So do you see any real life parallels between the characters you created and people you had in your real life, or real life scenarios that inspired them, or did you just wipe the slate and say, I got a story to tell, I'm going to make it up from scratch?
Oh, wait a second. I got to throw, because I had a similar question, but when I was reading about some of these, especially your leading man, Brian Murphy, the boozy leading manly man, I had envisioned that you were possible, and I could be way off, but I was thinking of troublesome actors like William Holden, Robert Mitchum, Spencer Tracy. Were they patterned after him?
Well, all of the above. Spencer Tracy primarily, because his image was so fatherly in so many of his films. Captain's Courageous, oh my God. Boys Town. Well, you could go on and on and then in the later career. Oh, and the rumpled, befuddled guy who did all those films with Katharine Hepburn. He was a raging, violent alcoholic. He tore up bars and people, and there was a lot of work that had to be. There was actually what do they call it? I'm not sure if it was a Tracy mobile, but they did have an ambulance that they would send in if he started to tear up a bar. They put in it, and but there were an awful lot of them, and I was fortunately spared that in my own career. For the most part, they don't allow the writer on the set, so you don't have a lot of contact with the stars. I suppose my closest contact with us, well, two of them, Bruce Willis, and then I got to know Valerie Harper really, really well. Neither one of them came into play in the writing of the book. I mean, yes, Hollywood is glamorous. Behind the scenes, not so glamorous. There's a lot of very, very bad behavior. My thinking in the book was, it's not on. I wrote my dissertation at Princeton on Scott Fitzgerald, and one of the things I did before I sat down to one of the last things I did before I sat down to write Someone to Watch Over Me was reread The Great Gatsby, because of the first person narration and how important that voice of Nick Carraway was. I think the voice of Jack Shannon is every bit as important in my book. But the parallel to Fitzgerald that comes to mind is The Beautiful and Damned. It's a very bad book with one of the greatest titles in history. People often call it The Beautiful and the Damned. As a matter of fact, most people call it that. No, they're missing the point. For Scott Fitzgerald, the beautiful were the damned. And I think that's true so often in Hollywood. These people who have everything, some of them have it handed to them, especially in the old days. And they abuse that great good luck. There are many people who don't make it in Hollywood who have every bit as much talent as those who do. The ones who remain real human beings are the ones who know they got lucky. The ones who got lucky overnight, they start to believe in their own myth. Bruce kind of falls into that category. If there was anyone in the room with the two of us, he played Bruce Willis. He played that character. As a matter of fact, when I met him in his trailer, moonlighting, he immediately said, I was writing a remake of In a Lonely Place, a terrific film starring Humphrey Bogart. He says, I'm going to be the new Humphrey Bogart. Modesty was not one of his faults. So he was a bartender, and the next week he was a superstar. And I think, it hurt him in ways, and led him to behave in ways he probably would not have otherwise. Now, Valerie was just the opposite. Oh my God, she was the sweetest, dearest lady you could ever hope to meet. And I can't say enough good. She'd bring candy to the set and pass it back around to all of the crew members. When she wrapped her part on Death of a Cheerleader, she got out a megaphone and said goodbye to everyone. Anyhow, she was a dear. So you find both sorts. Mostly what you find behind the scenes, not in front of the camera, but just the people who never get in front of the camera are people who are in love with the movies and realize what a privilege it is to work in them. But like I say, some of the stars start to believe their own myths, and that's too bad.
Yeah. Dan, returning to Shannon's character, we talked about this.
I just want to make sure we establish that Jack Shannon is our lead.
Jack Shannon,
to watch over
Jack
me.
Shannon
the PR guy, the quote unquote fixer guy. Yeah.
Right.
Yes. A lot of anybody that's ever watched Ray Donovan, I'm sure they'll draw comparisons. But Shannon is very different because he's got this dry wit, and it's wonderful you actually can hear it through the dialogue that Dan delivers. We had talked about Shannon's character about some of the inspiration. You might have gotten it from a book by Mark Harris called Five Come Back, a story of Hollywood in the Second World War. Can you elaborate for those not familiar with this narrative nonfiction?
Yes, it's a wonderful book, and I think it was turned into a documentary as well. It's the story of 5 Hollywood directors who, when the war broke out, volunteered and ended up making movies behind the lines. Many of them, it was John Ford, who was wounded doing one of his documentaries. It was Frank Capra, John Huston, his famous film is the Battle of San Pietro, which he restaged. He got there too late for the actual battle, but that was not known at the time. And then there was George Stevens, and I'm leaving out one of the big ones. I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on the fifth director. At any rate, the war changed all of them dramatically, and that's really what I was looking for. I wanted to get some sense of the kind of damage, because I've never been to war. I've been spared that experience. I have dear friends, including my brother, who have been, and who at some level of consciousness are fighting the war in Vietnam to this day. At any rate, I was particularly moved by Stevens, who was there for the freeing of the death camps, and whose documentary footage was used in the trials at Nuremberg. He was probably the top comedy director in Hollywood. I mean, he started out with those Laurel and Hardy things, some of the classic Laurel and Hardy's. Woman of the Year. I mean, the more the merrier. I mean, these wonderful, wonderful screwball comedies. He came back from the war, and as I recall, he never made another comedy. He did that terrific film with Montgomery Clift, based upon an American tragedy. Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor. He did Shane, The Diary of Anne Frank. I mean, his work was he was fundamentally forever altered, and everyone around him could see it in him. I also read extensively about J.D. Salinger, who experienced everything that my character, Jack Shannon, did. He survived D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the freeing of the death camps, and he came back forever changed. That's what led to all of this Eastern theology that informs his later work, and I think kept him from ever writing another great novel after Catcher in the Rye. Fundamentally changed by those experiences. So I did a lot of other reading about World War II and the way that it changed the people who fought it. There are 4 or 5 other books and a lot of articles, because I really wanted to know as close as I could firsthand. Obviously, it is secondhand, but it felt firsthand to me. You imagine your way into the minds of these people, and it becomes very, very real for you. But yeah, those are some of the sources of the character.
Okay, on a lighter note.
Wait, let me follow up real quick there, Ray.
Oh, go ahead.
Before I get light, because I got 2 things. I peeked real quick. Your 5th director there was William Wyler.
Yes, of course.
And that is a documentary series on Netflix. I think Meryl Streep even narrates it. They got no shortage of like quality directors, from Guillermo del Toro to Steven Spielberg, I think, to talk about the whole time, that whole era that you're talking about now.
Yeah, it's very good. It's very good.
Sorry, Ray, continue. Oh, and also, wait, no, there's one more thing. Because did you say John Huston like recreated something for his documentary?
For the Battle of San Pietro. I'm pretty sure that was the one.
He recreated a sequence in his propaganda documentary.
Yeah, he got there too late.
Okay.
Now, I think he also did the Battle for the Aleutians, or the something for the Aleutians. And that was real. But
I'll get up there and pretend to shoot each other, and I mean, it's crazy. Okay, well, it's a very powerful. I watched it. It's been a long time now, but it's very powerful. I can understand why it's kind of legendary. Propaganda. All right, Ray.
I was going to say, on a lighter note, the most interesting tidbit in Dan's book was the mention of the sewing circle. And the account was so vivid that I had to look it up. And lo and behold, I find that it was real. Dan, please give some facts about this group that not too many people nowadays know about.
No, they don't. The Sewing Circle was a group of female Hollywood stars who were lesbian or bisexual. And they tended to be those stars who were so cold they were hot, like Marlene Dietrich, like Greta Garbo. There were actually a bunch of them. And there have been 2 or 3 books written about the Sewing Circle. And even so, it somehow escaped wide public notice. And they would meet. Hattie McDaniel was apparently one of them.
Catherine Hepburn, I believe.
She could very well have been. There's so much controversy about her and about the relationship with Spencer Tracy. And, I almost wrote George Cukor's autobiography for him. And I spent some time at his place up off of Doheny. You go through this, there's this wall covered with ivy, and there's this full arched wooden gate. And you step in, there's terraced gardens leading up to this fabulous home with a swimming pool in front of it. The swimming pool, which was the model for the swimming pool in Something's Gotta Give, the Marilyn Monroe movie that was her last, that was incomplete, that almost drove him over the edge. And then down at the bottom of the garden, over on the one side, was the cottage where Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn conducted their affair. So he was quite a character, by the way. I don't know if you have any. It was a friend at the Directors Guild who put me in touch with him. I got a phone call from him, and without even a hello, it's Mr. Bronson, George Cukor here. He says, I suppose David Shepard has told you I'm going to write my autobiography. I'm thinking of calling it the greatest story ever told. So I understand that title may possibly have been used already. Are you a good writer, Mr. Bronson? I said, oh, I'm a great writer. A great director deserves a great writer. And he's, very good, very good. But if you are not, I shall find you out. Well, one of the world's great characters. And he was one of the enablers of that affair. So whether it was physical or not, I can't begin to tell you.
Well, you already have said that if you jump to fame, it's going to be a riskier road for you than if you sort of work your way or ease your way into it. And regardless, you need to have respect for the business and the industry and everything in it. What other advice do you have? Because you've obviously written about people here who are in trouble, and Jack Shannon's got to go take care of it. So what advice is there for young people coming into Hollywood in any position, whether it's actors or in executive positions like yours, who can equally get involved in a racy lifestyle?
Well, the first thing, I did an unproduced screenplay for USA Cable about an acting coach. And so I hung out with a bunch of the top acting coaches in Hollywood as research for this thing. And one of them said to me, Dan, I'll never be unemployed. And I said, really? How do you know that? And he said, well, every month, 6,000 young people show up in Hollywood hoping to become stars. And I thought, oh boy. It's the same with writers, would-be directors, would be anything to do with Hollywood. And what percentage of them actually make it? I couldn't begin to make an estimate. I know it would be a fraction of a percent. It's that hard.
I'll make the percentage. Let's go with 1.
Okay, I think you're a real optimist, and you definitly belong in Hollywood.
Yeah, I think Hollywood's
going to be that easy. A friend of mine did this book called Working in Hollywood years ago, and it was interviews with 55 people working in 55 different disciplines in Hollywood. I was the story editor. I had everyone from the craft services guys to the studio head. And one of the questions they asked me, I don't know whether it ever got in the book or not, but it's a question I was the first interviewed, and they ended up asking a lot of people the same question. What would you advise someone who wants to find a place for themselves in Hollywood? And I said, I would tell them, don't do it unless you're convinced that this is what you were born to do, that there's nothing else for you, that you're willing to put up with every frustration, every roadblock, every humiliation possible until finally luck strikes, if it ever strikes. And that's the brutal reality. So there's the one thing. Now, a more direct answer to your question, if you are among the lucky ones to get through, to get in, to get past the guardians at the gate, then remember how lucky you are. Remember how very, very lucky you are, because there are 1,000 other people out there who probably have just as much talent as you do, who didn't have that kind of luck, or maybe didn't have the stick-to-itiveness. You're very, very lucky. Keep that in mind. I think Tom Selleck turned out to be that kind of guy. You know, he was under contract at Universal for years and years and years, made all kinds of pilots. None of them took. And we're talking a lot of years. And then in the same week, he was offered Raiders of the Lost Ark as Indiana Jones and Magnum PI. And he got the Magnum PI offer just before he got the Raiders of the Lost Ark offer, and accepted it instead. But I've never really met him. I was in a room with him once and watched him interacting with other people. And he's just folks. He's not playing a role. I think he knows how lucky he is. And I don't think, I haven't talked to Bruce Willis in decades. He may be very, very different now. I hope he is. He's had a lot of well-deserved success, but back at the beginning, he was convinced that he deserved it. And I don't know that anyone deserves it. There are, as I say, a lot of talented people, and some of them get lucky.
For more in that vein, your first book was called Confessions of a Hollywood Nobody, and that you've called The Survivor's Guide to Hollywood. And I'll ask a few questions about that book, and just as I cap off the Someone to Watch Over Me segment of all this by saying, how do you celebrate the launching of a book during COVID? You're not, do you have anything planned? I mean, you can't go on speaking engagements, signings are off the table. So what are you doing to say, because by the time this airs, it'll be out. It's March 9th, available everywhere, Amazon. And like I said before, Barnes and Noble. So what are you doing? What's the big celebration? Is there one?
Well, I'm here.
Yeah, there we go.
Actually, this is the sort of thing that I'm trying to do. As a matter of fact, on Wednesday, I'm going to be doing another virtual appearance, this time on the Poison Pen Bookstore's Book Chats. And I'm going to be in a joint appearance with Phil Margolin, the one who has compared it's right on the cover of the book, has compared my book to The Big Sleep and the Maltese Falcon. He has written, well, I don't know how many he's written. He's way ahead of himself. I think he's published 24 books now, and most of them have been New York Times bestsellers. So it's a real privilege to be appearing with him. He's got the kind of audience that I haven't. I'm a Hollywood nobody. I mean, nobody knows my name. As a matter of fact, that's Emily Dickinson's wonderful poem, is sort of the epigram to my book. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? There's two of us. Don't tell. At any rate, the great thing about that is they post it on their Facebook page, and it stays up for a long, long time. And previous guests have included Michael Conley, Walter Mosley, James Patterson, let's see, Harlan Coben is coming up next week. So that kind of thing. And I'm just, trying to get as many of that, as much of that kind of exposure as I possibly can. Yeah, it's tough. And I hate it because I love doing public speaking. I have such a good time. And I love getting out and mixing with the public. Can't do it. So anyone else who would like to interview, I'm available.
Completely off the subject, but have you gotten your COVID vaccination yet?
Yes, I was among the lucky ones. My wife and I got our vaccinations about a week and a half ago. The second vaccination. The second one is less fun than the first.
I've heard.
Yeah.
And I hear it's 2 weeks after that second one where really you're as the most safe you're going to be in that transition period. So you're almost out of the woods. That's good.
Almost out of the woods. I'll find some other woods to get into.
Now, again, I mentioned this Confessions of a Hollywood Nobody is about the people who keep the Hollywood gears churning. There's, 98% of people you don't hear about who aren't Schwarzenegger or Natalie Wood or, but give me a story about just one of the names I saw in this book's description. Just whichever one's best. Katzenberg, Michael Eisner. Did you meet Hitchcock? Any one of those? Who's got the most interesting story of a run-in with you?
Let me start with Hitchcock. You remember I used to teach a seminar in Alfred Hitchcock. He's my hero. He is this man who made these immensely entertaining films that he lifted to the level of art. And that was always my objective as a screenwriter, that this is what you should try to do. Try and probably fail again and again and again, but that was my objective. So I considered him the Shakespeare of the cinema. And when I was interning at Universal, I was over at the news story editor's office. It was noon in the old motel building across the street from the main lot. I mean, it was as junky as things get. They were making the Blues Brothers at the time, and they were on down the hall, and they tore the place apart every night with drunken revelry. It was interesting. Anyhow, it's quiet, noon, no one's there. Phone rings, and John, the story editor, John Humphreys, answers the phone, and he says, Yes, Mr. Hitchcock, I'm familiar with your work. And I go, what? Alfred Hitchcock is on the phone, my hero, the genius, the great genius. And I'm having a meltdown while John is calmly talking to Alfred Hitchcock. And it turns out that the studio had put Hitchcock's latest picture, Short Night, in turnaround, largely because they felt he was too old and too alcoholic and too arthritic to make a picture in midwinter in Finland. And there may have been something to their thinking there. At any rate, he was looking for a new project. And John sent him Whispers by Dean Koontz, who was a cult writer at the time, not widely popular. It turns out Whispers would be his breakthrough book. And I got it the same night Hitchcock did. And I stayed up all night reading it. And it was about that high in manuscript. 3 a.m, I put it on the edge of the bed. I got down on my knees beside the bed, and the pain in my knees kept me awake till I could get through to the end. I was so excited by this thing. And I went back and raved about, well, Hitchcock loved it as much as I did. And John made a deal for him. And Ned Tannen, who later became a dear friend and my boss at Paramount, he was head of production at Universal at the time. He calls John up. Now, John is the newly appointed story editor. He's just gotten the job. And Ned says, "What do you think you're doing? You be nice to that old man. You say yes to that old man, but you never, ever do business with that old man." Well, the deal went away. I tracked it, and it went to, I think it was CBS Theatrical, and they hired the writer of Zeffirelli's Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, the story of St. Francis of Assisi. to do the adaptation. And I'm, what? No, it didn't go anywhere. They spent a lot of money, and they just let it go. So that I stepped in with my producing partner at the time, Donna Dubrow, and we took it over to Ted Field, who was just getting Interscope Pictures started, and I gave the first and possibly best pitch of my life. I had Ted leaning over like this and back like this, jumping, I'd be pounding on the desk, and then I refused to tell him the end. And we had a deal when we walked out of the office. So Hitchcock really, though he never knew it, was responsible for my becoming a writer. I can tell you stories of many others. I mean, whatever you like.
Well, here I'm going to pinpoint a few because go
Sure.
get that book too. Then if you're out buying Dan Bronson's books, get them both.